Welcome to the Moonlit Archive. Tonight's entry, Inferno Beneath the Marble. 8,000 people bathed here every day. 8,000 bodies, washed and oiled and scraped clean in rooms of white marble the size of cathedrals. 8,000 citizens of Rome, senators and shopkeepers, soldiers and students, freedmen and philosophers, moving through a building so vast that you could walk for 10 minutes without retracing your steps, and every surface you touched would be warm. Not warm like a room heated by a fire, warm like something alive. The floors were warm. The walls were warm. The marble benches where bathers sat and talked and argued and dozed were warm. The water in the great pools, the pools that could hold 100 people at once, pools lined with mosaic in blue and gold and green, was warm. Even the air was warm. Thick with steam, fragrant with oils and perfumes, moving slowly through vaulted spaces so enormous that the steam rose and gathered beneath the ceiling like clouds trapped indoors. The Baths of Caracalla, Thermae Antoninianae, built between 212 and 216 of the Common Era, during the reign of the emperor whose name they carry, though Caracalla himself was murdered before they were fully complete. Stabbed by a bodyguard while urinating by the side of a road in Mesopotamia, if the ancient sources are to be believed. He was 29 years old. He had ruled for 6 years, and in that time he had massacred the citizens of Alexandria, debased the currency, and commissioned the largest bathhouse in the world. History remembers the Bathhouse. The baths outlived their builder by 3 centuries. They outlived the empire itself. They stand today roofless, stripped of marble, open to the sky, as one of the most imposing ruins in Rome. In summer, they host opera performances. The Teatro dello Preti Roma uses the Caldarium as a stage, and the audience sits in the ancient exercise yard, and the music rises through the broken vaults into the Roman night. It is magnificent. It is strange. And it is built on foundations that most of the audience will never see. because the opera goers do not go down. They do not descend the staircase to the service tunnels. They do not walk the corridors where the furnace workers walked. They sit above, in the warmth of a summer evening, listening to Verdi or Puccini, and the tunnels below them are dark and empty and cool, and the marks on the walls are invisible in the night. Imagine the building, not as ruins, not as the broken walls and roofless chambers that tourists photograph today, with weeds growing through the mosaic floors and pigeons nesting in the window arches. Imagine it whole. Imagine it as it was. The main building alone covered more than 6 acres. The grounds, including gardens, libraries, shops, and exercise courts, covered 27. The precinct measured roughly 337 meters on each side, larger than 3 city blocks in any modern city. A complex the size of a small town, dedicated entirely to the act of bathing. And bathing in Rome was not merely hygiene, it was civilization. It was the daily ritual that made a Roman a Roman, the shared experience that crossed every boundary of class and occupation, the one place where the richest senator and the poorest freedman stood in the same water, beneath the same ceiling, breathing the same steam. There were 2 libraries in the complex, one for Greek texts, one for Latin. There were shops selling oils and perfumes and snacks. There were gardens with fountains and sculpture, the kind of space where a person could spend an entire afternoon without bathing at all, simply walking and reading and existing in an environment designed to make existence feel like luxury. The baths were not merely a building. They were a city within a city, a world unto themselves. The facade was enormous. Brick and concrete, clad in marble travertine for the lower courses, white Proconnesian marble for the upper walls, columns of gray granite imported from Egypt. Some of those columns weighed over 60 tons. They had been quarried at Mont Claude-Annus in the eastern desert, transported by ox-drawn sledge to the Nile, loaded onto barges, shipped across the Mediterranean, unloaded at Ostia, and dragged up the Tiber to Rome. The logistics of a single column would have taken months. The baths had dozens. The windows were glazed, not with clear glass, which the Romans could make but found too revealing, but with thick, greenish panes that admitted light while blurring the world outside. The effect from within was of being enclosed in a luminous cave, warm, diffused, dreamlike. You entered through a vestibule. The floor beneath your feet was mosaic, black and white geometric patterns in the corridors, or scenes of marine life in the main halls. Dolphins and tritons and sea creatures tumbling through stylized waves, rendered in thousands of tiny tesserae, cubes of stone, each one roughly a centimeter square, cut by hand, pressed into mortar, arranged by artisans who spent months on a single panel. The tesserae were colored naturally: black basalt, white limestone, red brick, green serpentine, blue-gray slate. The best mosaics used glass tesserae for highlights, tiny cubes of colored glass that caught the light and glittered beneath the surface of the standing water that occasionally pooled on the floor. Your sandals had been left at the entrance with an attendant. Your feet were bare on the warm stone, and the warmth was the first thing you noticed, before the sound, before the light, before the smell. The warmth came up through the mosaic, through the mortar, through the layer of concrete and brick that separated the floor from the Hypocaust chamber below. It entered through the soles of your feet and traveled upward, settling into your ankles, your calves, your knees, rising through your body like water filling a vessel from the bottom. By the time you had walked 20 steps into the building, you were warm in a way that no surface heat could achieve. Warm from the ground up, warm from the inside out, warm in a way that loosened muscles you did not know were tense, and released a breath you did not know you were holding. This was the genius of the Hypocaust, not the temperature. The Romans could have heated the baths with braziers, open fires in metal containers, the standard heating method for most Roman buildings. Braziers heated the air. The Hypocaust heated the structure. It heated the building itself, the floors, the walls, the benches, the pools. Everything the bather touched was warm. The warmth was not in the air, it was in the world. The first thing you noticed was the sound. Seneca wrote about it. He lived above a bathhouse for a time, a smaller one, not Caracalla, which had not yet been built, but the sounds were the same. He described them with the exasperated precision of a man who could not sleep. The grunting of men lifting weights in the exercise yard. The slap of the macer's hands on oiled skin, plossus manum, he called it, and the way the sound changed depending on whether the shoulders were flat or cupped. The splash of a man jumping into the cold pool. The cries of the sausage seller, the cake seller, the drink seller, each with a distinctive pitch designed to carry above the din. The shouts of a man having his armpit hair plucked, alipilus, the hair plucker, a common grooming practice that Seneca found particularly grating. He could tell, he claimed, when the hair plucker had found a particularly stubborn hair, because the client's yelp changed pitch. And beneath it all, a constant, low murmur, the sound of hundreds of conversations happening simultaneously, echoing off the marble walls and vaulted ceilings, blending into a warm, oceanic hum. Seneca hated the noise, but he was honest enough to admit that the silence of a bathhouse was worse, that an empty bathhouse felt wrong the way an empty theater feels wrong. The building needed people to be complete. It needed the sound of lives being lived inside it. Without the noise, the marble was just stone. This was the world above. It was beautiful. It was democratic in its way, the one institution in Rome where rank was left at the door along with your clothes. It was a place of leisure and pleasure and community, where deals were struck and friendships formed and gossip exchanged, and the business of being Roman was conducted in an atmosphere of warmth and steam and shared nakedness. And it was all made possible by people you never saw. Beneath the marble floors, beneath the mosaics and the warm stone and the pools of heated water, there was another world. A world of tunnels and furnaces, of darkness and smoke and relentless, crushing heat. A world where men worked in shifts that lasted from dawn to long after dusk, feeding fires that could never be allowed to die, because the moment a fire died, the marble above went cold, and the bathers noticed, and someone was punished. The people who worked in that world were slaves, most of them. Not all there were freedmen among the furnace workers and occasionally hired labor, but the vast majority were property. Human beings owned by the state or by private contractors, assigned to the hottest, darkest, most dangerous work in the Roman infrastructure. The Romans had a word for them: fornicatores, the furnace tenders. It appears in a handful of inscriptions, a few legal texts, the occasional passing mention in a letter. It is not a word that appears in poetry or philosophy or the speeches of senators. It is a word from the margins of the language, a job title for people who were not supposed to have titles, a name for the unnamed. They had actual names too. They had families, some of them. They scratched marks on the tunnel walls, tally marks, counting something, days, shifts. We do not know for certain, but we know they counted. We know they wanted to remember. Tonight we go beneath the marble. We descend into the tunnels where the furnace workers lived and labored. We listen to the sounds they heard, the muffled laughter from above, the crack and roar of the fire, the echo of their own breathing in the dark. And we try to understand what it meant to be the invisible foundation of the most visible luxury in the ancient world. But there is no hurry. The tunnels are patient. They have been waiting beneath the ruins for 18 centuries. They will wait a little longer for you. Settle in. Let the warmth of the story find you. There is nothing required of you tonight, no names to memorize, no dates to remember. Only the sound of the fire and the stone and the voices that echo in the dark. We will begin above in the light, in the marble, in the world of warmth and water and leisure, and then we will descend, slowly, through the staircase that the bathers never used, into the tunnels that the architects never described, among the people that the historians never named. If you drift off before we resurface, that is as it should be. The tunnels will still be here. The marks on the wall will still be waiting to be read. And the warmth that rises through everything in this story, through the marble and the mortar and the time between us and them, will still be here when you wake. Let us descend. The staircase goes down. Not far, perhaps 12 feet, perhaps 15. The distance from the main floor of the bathhouse to the service level below. But the change is immediate and total. The marble disappears. The mosaic disappears. The warm, diffused light from the glazed windows disappears. What replaces it is brick. Rough, unfinished brick. The structural bones of the building, never intended to be seen, never intended to be beautiful. The air changes too. Above it was humid, fragrant with oils and perfumes, the kind of warmth that opens the pores and loosens the muscles. Down here, the warmth is different. It is dry. It is aggressive. It pushes against your skin like a hand pressing on your chest. And it smells not of lavender and olive oil, but of wood smoke, of heated dust, of something mineral and ancient. The smell of stone being cooked. The tunnels are wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast, though you would not want to. The ceiling is low. An average man would need to duck in places. The floor is packed earth in some sections, brick in others, worn smooth by the passage of feet carrying fuel. There are no windows. The only light comes from the furnaces themselves, a flickering orange glow that reaches into the tunnels from the mouth of each Praefrenium, casting long shadows that move and shudder with the fire. A Praefrenium. The word comes from the Latin before, and furnace, oven. The furnace that sits before the bath. Each of the great baths at Caracalla had multiple Praefrenia. Estimates range from 40 to 50 of them, distributed beneath the building like the chambers of a vast underground heart, each one responsible for heating a different section of the floor and walls above. 50 furnaces. 50 fires burning simultaneously every day for 300 years. The largest fed the caldarium, the hot bath, and the laconicum, the dry heat room. The smallest maintained the tepidarium, the warm room, where bathers lingered between hot and cold. And each furnace required at least one person, usually 2, working in shifts to keep it burning. That means at any given time, somewhere between 50 and 100 people were working in the tunnels beneath the Baths of Caracalla. 100 human beings in the dark, in the heat, tending flames that the world above took for granted. 100 people who together consumed a small forest every day and produced nothing visible, no product, no monument, no artifact, only warmth. Only the invisible gift of heated stone. Imagine the furnace, a rectangular opening in the tunnel wall, roughly 4 feet wide and 3 feet tall, framed in brick that has been scorched black by decades of continuous fire. Inside, a bed of coals glowing orange-white, topped with logs oak when it was available, because oak burns slowly and hot, or pine, which burns faster but is easier to split, or whatever the supply chain delivered that week. The heat coming from this opening is extraordinary. Step within 3 feet of it, and the hair on your arms begins to curl, your eyes sting, and the air you breathe feels like it has been stripped of moisture, as if the fire is drinking the water from your lungs. Above the fire chamber. This is the heart of the Hypocaust. The word means fire beneath, from the Greek hypo, under, and kaustos, burned. The chamber is perhaps 2 feet high, supported by dozens of small brick pillars called pilae, each one roughly 2 feet tall, spaced about 18 inches apart. They hold up the floor above, the marble floor, the mosaic floor, the floor where the bathers walk barefoot, and the space between the pillars allows the hot air from the furnace to spread beneath the entire room. The air flows. This is the engineering genius of the Hypocaust. Hot air rises, but in a confined space, it also moves laterally, spreading outward from the furnace mouth through the forest of pilae, filling the chamber beneath the floor, heating the stone above. And then, because the Romans understood that heat rises and must be given somewhere to go, the hot air travels upward through hollow spaces built into the walls. Tiubuli, rectangular clay pipes stacked vertically inside the wall cavity, and exits through vents in the roof. The entire building breathes. The fire feeds air into the Hypocaust feeds air into the walls feed air into the sky. And the building stays warm, not in patches, not in spots near the fire, but uniformly, evenly, the way a modern building with central heating stays warm. The Romans had central heating. They had it 2,000 years ago. They built it with brick and clay and fire and the labor of human hands. Here is a detail worth holding. The water supply for the Baths of Caracalla came from a dedicated branch of the Aqua Marcia, one of Rome's 11 great aqueducts. The branch carried an estimated 18.5 gallons per second into the complex. Per second. That is more than 1,000 gallons per minute, more than 60,000 gallons per hour, pouring continuously into the pools and fountains and boilers of a single building. The engineering required to heat that volume of water to take 60,000 gallons of cold mountain water every hour and bring it to bathing temperature is staggering. And all of it depended on fire, on wood, on the people who fed the wood into the fire. The Baths of Caracalla were the third largest thermae in Rome. The Baths of Diocletian, built a century later, were even bigger. Rome had nearly 1,000 smaller bathhouses as well, neighborhood balnea, heated by the same Hypocaust technology, tended by the same invisible workforce. An entire city kept warm by people who lived beneath it. The labor of hands that never touched the marble they heated. The man at the furnace, let us call him that, the man, though the sources rarely name them, stands to one side of the Praefurnium opening, feeding logs into the fire with a long iron hook. He cannot stand directly in front of the opening. The heat would blister his skin within minutes. He works from the side, reaching in at an angle, pushing the wood into position, raking the coals to maintain an even bed. His skin is dark with soot, not the color of his birth, whatever that was, wherever he came from, but the color of his work. The soot gets into everything, into the creases of his hands, into the lines of his face, into the ridges of his fingernails, into the fabric of whatever rough tunic he wears, a tunica, undyed, the cheapest available, replaced when it fell apart. The soot settles into his lungs. It lives in his hair. After enough years, it becomes indistinguishable from skin. He is the color of smoke. The Romans had a phrase, phioliginosus, soot-covered. It appears in Pliny and in the agricultural writers usually applied to chimneys or hearths, but it could have described the workers too. They were phylogenosi. They were the human chimneys of Rome. The smoke passed through them on its way to the sky, and some of it stayed. His hands tell the story most clearly. The calluses on his palms, from gripping the iron hook that pushes the logs, are thick and cracked and permanently dark. The skin on his forearms is leathered from heat exposure, tight, shiny in places, marked with the pale scars of old burns that healed without treatment. His nails are chipped and black. His knuckles are swollen, not from fighting, but from the repetitive motion of gripping and pulling, the daily labor of moving heavy wood in an awkward position, reaching around the side of a praefrenium that is too hot to approach directly. These hands were not examined by physicians. They were not documented in medical texts. They were not considered worthy of description by the writers who described everything else in Rome. The hands of sculptors, the hands of surgeons, the hands of gladiators, the hands of orators trained to gesture with precision. The hands of the fornicator were invisible. They existed only in the tunnels, in the heat, in the dark, doing work that made everything above them possible, and that no one above them wished to see. He has been doing this since before dawn. He will do it until after dark. The fires cannot be allowed to die. If the fires die, the floors go cold. If the floors go cold, the bathers complain. If the bathers complain, someone comes down the stairs, someone who does not belong in the tunnels, someone clean and oiled and angry, and the consequences fall on the man at the furnace. The fire must be fed. That is the only rule that matters down here. Everything else, comfort, rest, dignity, hope, is secondary. The fire must be fed. And so he feeds it, log after log, hour after hour, day after day. The rhythm of it becomes automatic: reach, pull, feed, rake, reach, pull, feed, rake. A pattern so repetitive that the body learns to perform it without the mind's participation, the way a heartbeat continues without conscious effort. The mind goes elsewhere. It has to. The alternative is to be present, fully present, in a tunnel beneath the earth, feeding a fire that heats marble you will never touch, for people you will never meet in exchange for nothing. The mind goes elsewhere, and that perhaps is the beginning of something, not freedom, not escape, but the first faint suggestion that existence might contain something other than fire. That somewhere beyond the tunnel, beyond the stairs, beyond the marble that he heats but cannot touch, there is a world where the air is cool and the sky is visible and the sounds are not muffled by 12 feet of stone. He has seen that world. He sees it every time he carries ash to the refuse yard. Every time a wood delivery arrives and the tunnel door opens for a moment and a wedge of daylight falls across the packed earth floor. He sees it, and then the door closes and the light disappears and the fire needs feeding. The fire always needs feeding. The heat has layers. Closest to the perineum, within arm's reach of the fire, the air temperature can exceed 150 degrees. This is not a place for lingering. This is the zone where the fuel is fed, where the coals are raked, where the long iron hooks are used to push and arrange the burning wood. A worker enters this zone, performs his task, and withdraws. Speed is survival. Efficiency is health. A few feet back, the temperature drops, but only to something like 110, 120 degrees. This is where the worker stands for most of his shift, still brutally hot by any modern standard, still hot enough to cause heat exhaustion, dehydration, burns from accidental contact with heated brick, but survivable, sustainable if you drink enough water and pace yourself and know when to step further back into the cooler sections of the tunnel. And further back still, 10 feet, 15 feet from the furnace mouth, the tunnels are merely warm. Hot by the standards of the world above, but tolerable. Almost comfortable in the winter months when the streets of Rome are cold and wet, and the tunnels offer the only warmth a furnace slave is likely to know. There is a detail about the heat that I think is worth pausing for. The floor above, the marble floor where the bathers walked, was heated unevenly. The section directly above the Hypocaust chamber, closest to the furnace, was the hottest. Too hot to walk on barefoot. The Romans knew this. Bathers in the Caldarium wore wooden-soled sandals to protect their feet from the heated floor. The sandals were thick, an inch or more of wood between skin and stone, and even so, bathers could feel the warmth rising through them. Think about that. The floor was so hot that even through wooden sandals you could feel it. And beneath that floor, separated from it by 2 feet of air and a layer of brick, was a man. A human being, standing in air that was hotter still, breathing air that was thicker still, his bare feet on packed earth that had been heated by decades of continuous fire until it was warm year-round, even in the dead of winter. The bather felt warmth through an inch of wood and thought of comfort. The worker felt the same heat without protection and thought of nothing at all, because thinking about it served no purpose. There is a passage in Seneca, letter 47, written to his friend Lucilius, that stops me every time I encounter it. Seneca is writing about slavery, not about furnace workers specifically, but about the institution itself, and the casual cruelty with which Roman masters treated the people they owned. Ili servi sunt, Seneca writes, imo homines. They are slaves. No, they are human beings. He goes on, they are slaves, he says, but they are also fellow human beings. They are slaves, but they are humble friends. They are slaves, but they are fellow slaves, because fortune has power over all of us equally. And then this. I do not wish to involve myself in a huge topic and discuss the treatment of slaves, toward whom we are excessively arrogant, excessively cruel, and excessively abusive. Seneca knew, the Romans knew. They knew that the system they had built, the system that heated their marble and carried their water and cooked their food and raised their children, was built on cruelty. They knew and they wrote about it, and they did not stop. They could articulate the injustice with crystalline precision and then walk barefoot across a heated floor without a second thought. That is perhaps the most disturbing thing about the Roman world. Not the cruelty itself. Every civilization has cruelty, but the self-awareness, The ability to see the system clearly and continue to benefit from it. To write a letter about the humanity of slaves while a slave stokes the fire that heats the room where you are writing. The furnace workers would not have read Seneca. Most of them could not read at all, but they did not need a philosopher to tell them they were human. They knew that already. They had always known. The fuel came in carts. Ox-drawn carts that arrived at the service entrances of the bathhouse several times a day, loaded with wood cut and split in the forests around Rome, and transported along the roads that connected the city to its hinterland. The Baths of Caracalla alone consumed an estimated 10 tons of wood per day. Some estimates are higher. 10 tons of wood every day for 300 years. Think about what that means for the landscape. The forests around Rome were stripped. The wood had to come from further and further away as the decades passed, from Umbria, from Campania, from across the sea. The cost was staggering. The logistics were complex. And at the bottom of the supply chain, at the very end of the process, stood a man in a tunnel feeding the wood into a furnace, one log at a time. The wood was not uniform. Oak was preferred. It burned hot and long, producing a steady bed of coals that maintained temperature for hours. Pine was common. It ignited quickly and burned bright, useful for boosting heat when the caldarium demanded more. Occasionally, olive wood which burns with a particular sweetness, a fragrance that might have been the only pleasant smell in the tunnels. The workers learned to read the wood the way a chef reads ingredients. They knew which logs would burn fast and which would last. They knew how to arrange the fire for maximum efficiency, banking it for a slow burn during quiet hours, opening it up for a roaring blaze when the baths were full and the demand for heat peaked. This was skilled work. Not in the way that the Romans recognized skill, not the skill of an orator or a general or an architect, but skill nonetheless. The ability to maintain a precise temperature in a massive building using nothing but fire and intuition was a kind of engineering, invisible engineering, the engineering of people who were never asked their opinion and never given credit for their knowledge. I want to tell you something about the wood. A fascination, a small piece of engineering history that most people overlook. The Romans did not simply burn whatever was at hand. The heating of a great bathhouse was a science, not a formal science, not one taught in schools or written about by philosophers, but a practical science developed over centuries by the people who did the work. The fornicatores understood combustion the way a vintner understands fermentation, intuitively, precisely, through accumulated experience that was passed from worker to worker, shift to shift, never written down. They knew, for instance, that the orientation of the logs mattered. Logs laid parallel to the draft burned evenly. Logs stacked crosswise burned fast and hot, useful for raising temperature quickly, dangerous if left unattended. They knew that the size of the air gap between the logs determined the flame height, and that the flame height determined how far the heat penetrated into the hypocaust. They knew that a compact bed of coals was better for sustained, even heating than a tall fire with large logs, because coals radiate heat uniformly while flames are directional and unpredictable. None of this was written down. None of it appears in Vitruvius, who wrote extensively about bathhouse design, but never once described the operation of the furnaces, only their dimensions and placement. The knowledge existed only in the hands and eyes and instincts of the workers. When they died, or were freed, or were sold to a different master, the knowledge went with them. And the next worker at the furnace had to learn it all again, by watching, by doing, by burning his hands on hot iron until the heat became legible. The stoking cycle followed the rhythm of the baths above. The baths opened in the early afternoon, the 6th or 7th hour by Roman reckoning, roughly 1 or 2 o'clock by modern clocks. But the fires had to be started hours before opening, because the Hypocaust System was massive and slow to heat. The thermal inertia of several acres of brick and marble meant that it took 4 to 6 hours for the floors to reach bathing temperature from a cold start. This meant the furnace workers began their day before dawn. In the darkness, in the tunnels, raking out the previous day's ash, which had been allowed to cool overnight but never fully extinguished, rebuilding the fire bed, feeding in the first logs of the day, watching the flames catch and grow, feeling the temperature in the tunnel begin to rise as the Hypocaust chamber filled with hot air and the pile began to glow dull orange in the darkness. By the time the first bathers arrived, the floors were warm. By mid-afternoon, they were hot. By evening, when the baths closed and the crowds dispersed, the furnace workers began the process of banking the fires, reducing them to a low, steady burn that would maintain enough residual heat through the night to make the morning restart faster. The fires never fully stopped. Even overnight, even in the deepest hours, a low flame burned in each praefrenium. Someone had to tend it. Someone had to be there in the tunnel in the dark, keeping the ember alive. The night shift, the quietest hours, when the baths above were empty and the tunnels were silent except for the soft crack and whisper of coals settling. The night shift was a different experience from the day. During the day, the tunnel was a machine, purposeful, urgent, driven by the demand of 8,000 bathers who expected hot water and warm floors and did not care how it happened. At night, the machine idled. The fire was low. The coals glowed but did not flame. The heat was gentle, almost domestic, almost comfortable, and the silence from above was complete. No footsteps, no laughter, no splashing. Just the building, breathing slowly in the dark, releasing its stored heat into the Roman night like an animal releasing warmth into a burrow. The night workers were the loneliest. A single man at each praefrenium, spaced 30 or 40 feet apart, each one alone with his fire and his thoughts. They could call to each other, and they did sometimes a word or two shouted down the tunnel, an acknowledgement that someone else was there, that the darkness was shared. But mostly they were silent. Mostly they sat with their backs against the warm brick and watched the coals and waited. It was in those hours, the hours between midnight and dawn, when the city above was sleeping and the tunnel below was quiet and the fire needed only occasional attention, that the mind was most free, most dangerous, most alive. It was in those hours that a man might think about his life before the tunnel. about the place he came from, about the family he had left or been taken from, about the day his freedom was purchased, or the day he stopped believing it would be. About the sound of a language he had not spoken in years, fading in his memory like a fire that was not being fed. Those were the hours when the marks were made on the walls. He could hear them. Not clearly, not individual words, not conversations. The floor above was too thick for that, and the fire too loud. But sounds carried through stone in ways that air does not. Low frequencies traveled best, the bass rumble of many feet moving across a marble floor, the deep splash of a body entering a pool, the percussive slap of a masseur's hands, and laughter. Laughter carried particularly well through stone. It arrived in the tunnels as a muffled vibration, stripped of its sharpness, smoothed by its passage through brick and mortar into something that was felt as much as heard. He learned to read the sounds the way the guards at Nijo Castle learned to read the nightingale floors, not as language, but as pattern, as information. The morning sounds were administrative. The hollow boom of the great wooden doors opening, the voices of attendants calling to each other across the vestibule, the drag and clatter of wooden buckets being filled and emptied as the pools were cleaned and refilled. These sounds meant that the day had begun, that the fires needed to be at full strength, that the long hours of stoking were about to start. The midday sounds were a transition. The first bathers arriving, their footsteps lighter than the attendants, less purposeful, more exploratory. The murmur of conversation beginning to fill the spaces above. A single splash, then another, then the continuous liquid sound of a pool in use. These sounds meant that the baths were open, that the temperature was being tested, judged, evaluated by feet more sensitive than any thermometer. The worker at the furnace listened for complaints, not the words themselves, which he could not hear, but the rhythm of the sounds above. Contentment had a particular frequency. Displeasure had another. The afternoon was the peak. The sounds from above reached their greatest volume between the 7th and 10th hours, 2 o'clock to 5 o'clock roughly. This was when the baths were fullest, when the caldarium was at its hottest, when the demand on the furnaces was greatest. The worker could hear it, a dense, oceanic roar of voices and water and movement that came through the floor like the sound of the sea through the hull of a ship. He was beneath it, swimming in the vibration of it. Sustained by it in a strange way, because as long as the sounds continued, the baths were functioning. And as long as the baths were functioning, the world had order. And as long as the world had order, he knew what was expected of him. The evening sounds were the most revealing, the crowd thinning, the individual voices beginning to separate from the mass. A single pair of feet crossing the caldarium floor, he could hear them now that the room was nearly empty. The attendants beginning their closing routine. The scrape of a strigil being cleaned. The clank of a bucket. And then, gradually, silence. The silence of an empty building. The silence of warm stone cooling, of water stilling, of an enormous machine winding down for the night. But the furnace workers' day was not over. The fires still burned. The fires would burn all night. And in the silence, when the sounds from above had stopped, the tunnel had its own voice. The crack and pop of burning wood, the low moan of hot air moving through the Hypocaust chamber, the drip of condensation from heated walls. These were the sounds of his world. The only world that existed down here in the dark. And perhaps this is a good moment to pause. If you are still listening, if you have followed the descent through the staircase and the tunnels and the heat, I am glad. And if the warmth of the story has already carried you off to sleep, that is good too. The fire will still be burning when you return. But for those still with me, there is something about the sounds that I have not yet mentioned. Something that the furnace workers heard that was not laughter, not conversation, not the business of bathing. Something that came through the stone at unexpected moments, in the quiet gaps between other sounds, like light through a crack in a wall. Music. The Romans bathed to music. Not always, not everywhere, but in the great thermae and the Baths of Caracalla, In the Baths of Diocletian, musicians played. Flute players and lyre players hired to provide atmosphere the way a modern hotel plays music in its lobby. The sound drifted through the steam and down through the stone and into the tunnels below, where a man covered in soot heard a melody he could not name, played for people he could not see, in a room he would never enter. It is a small detail, but I think it matters, because it means the tunnels were not soundproof. The world above leaked through, and the world below, the crack of fire, the clang of an iron hook against brick, the cough of a man who had been breathing smoke since dawn leaked upward. Seneca, in his famous letter about bathhouse noise, never identifies the source of the deep rumble he hears beneath the floorboards. He attributes it to the building, to the plumbing, to the vague machinery of the place. He does not consider that it might be a person. The rumble beneath the floor was a man. The warmth beneath the marble was a body working, and the philosopher who lived above it heard it every day and never knew. There is one more sound worth mentioning, the water itself. The great pools of the bathhouse were supplied by a continuous flow. Water entered at one end and drained at the other, keeping the pools clean and the temperature stable. The flow created a low, constant murmur, the sound of water moving through stone channels, dropping through pipes, filling basins. From above, this was a pleasant backdrop. From below, it was different. The drainage channels ran through the service level. The workers could hear the water rushing past them in the dark. Clean water, warm water, water that had washed the bodies of citizens, flowing through brick channels at their feet, heading for the Tiber. Water they could hear but not use for bathing. Water that flowed through their world without belonging to it. The sound of the water was the sound of the divide, always present, always moving, always just out of reach. The days were not all the same. That is something that is easy to forget. Easy when you imagine a life of repetitive labor, to flatten it into a single, undifferentiated experience. But the furnace workers knew the difference between days as well as any farmer knows the difference between seasons. There were feast days, when the baths stayed open longer and the crowds were larger and the fires had to burn hotter and the shift stretched past the point of endurance. There were holidays, when the baths closed early or opened late and the tunnels were quieter and the workers could tend the fires at a gentler pace. There were winter days, when the cold outside made the tunnels feel almost welcoming, the warmth of the furnace a comfort rather than a punishment, and summer days, when the heat from above and the heat from below merged into something unbearable, and the workers survived by drinking water constantly and retreating to the coolest sections of the tunnel whenever the fire allowed. There were days when the wood supply was good, dry oak, properly seasoned, that burned clean and hot with minimal smoke. And there were days when the supply was poor, green wood, still wet, that hissed and spat and filled the tunnels with thick, acrid smoke that burned the eyes and coated the lungs. The workers could tell within seconds of touching a new delivery whether it was good wood or bad. They learned this the way any craftsman learns, through experience, through their hands, through years of paying attention to something that no one else thought worth noticing. And there were the days when something went wrong. A section of the Hypocaust would collapse, the peel crumbling under the weight of the floor above, creating a gap in the heating system that sent cold spots through the marble. A repair crew would be sent down, masons, usually, supervised by an architectus or his assistant, and the furnace workers would guide them through the tunnels, showing them where the damage was, holding torches in the darkness while strangers from the world above knelt in the heat, and rebuilt the pillars that held their luxury in place. Or a fire would get out of control, too much wood, too much air, a draft from a poorly sealed vent, and the temperature in the tunnel would spike to dangerous levels. The workers knew how to handle this. They had protocols block the air intake, spread the coals, starve the fire back to a manageable level. But there were injuries, burns, smoke inhalation, heat collapse. The ancient sources mention them rarely because the ancient sources rarely mention furnace workers at all. But the injuries happened. They happened in the dark, in the heat, far from any physician who would have considered a slave worth treating. The medical writer Galen, who spent years in Rome and wrote extensively about the effects of heat on the human body, never once mentions the men who tended the fires. He wrote about the therapeutic benefits of hot baths with great enthusiasm and precision. He described the ideal temperature for the caldarium. He discussed the physiology of sweating, the opening and closing of pores, the circulation of humors through heated tissue. He prescribed the baths for dozens of ailments. But the people who made the heat, the people who spent 16 hours a day in temperatures that Galen would have recognized as medically dangerous, are invisible in his writing. They are as absent from his medical texts as the fire is absent from the marble floor. It is one of those silences in history that once you notice it, you cannot unnotice. The physicians studied heat. The architects designed heat systems. The bathers enjoyed heat. But no one studied or designed for or cared about the people who produced it. I should tell you something about the structure of the workday that is easy to overlook. The stoking cycle was not continuous. It was rhythmic. The furnace worker did not simply stand at the mouth of the perineum and feed wood for 16 hours straight. He worked in bursts, intense periods of feeding and raking, lasting perhaps 20 or 30 minutes, followed by intervals of maintenance, when the fire was burning well and required only occasional attention. During those intervals, he waited. He sat on the tunnel floor, or leaned against the brick wall, or retreated to a cooler section of the passage where a water jug was kept. He drank. He rested. He talked if there was someone to talk to, and there usually was, because the furnaces were spaced along the tunnel at regular intervals, and the man at the next perineum was rarely more than 30 feet away. These intervals were the closest thing to leisure that a furnace worker knew. They were brief, 10 minutes, perhaps 15, rarely more. They were unpredictable. The fire set its own schedule, and a sudden drop in temperature or a shift in the draft could end a rest period without warning. But they were real. And here is something worth pausing on. The rhythm of the worker's day, intense labor followed by enforced rest, repeated in cycles throughout the shift, was not unlike the rhythm of the baths themselves. The bathers, too, moved in cycles, hot to cold, exertion to rest, the palustra to the tepidarium to the caldarium to the frigidarium. The Roman bathing routine was structured as a series of contrasts, each experience defined by the one that preceded it, each rest made meaningful by the labor that came before. The workers lived the same pattern, not by design, not by choice, but by the nature of the fire, which demanded intensity and then permitted rest, which flared and then subsided, which imposed on the human body a rhythm that was, accidentally, the same rhythm the architects had designed for the experience above. The difference, of course, was that the bathers chose their rhythm, and the workers endured theirs. But in those intervals, in the spaces between the work, the furnace workers did something that no one expected, and no one recorded, and no one would discover for 18 centuries. They made a world. Here is something that I think is worth knowing, even if it is tangential. The Romans were not the only ancient civilization to use underfloor heating. The Koreans developed a similar system called ondol, heated floors, warmed by channels of hot air running beneath the living space. The ondol system is at least 2,000 years old, and it is still in use today. In Korea, heated floors are not a luxury. They are the standard. Every apartment, every house, every hotel room has a heated floor, because the culture never forgot what the Romans forgot. That warmth from beneath is the most natural, the most efficient, the most comforting way to heat a space. Romans forgot. When the empire fell and the bathhouses closed and the furnaces went cold, the knowledge of the Hypocaust died with it. Europe would not have central heating again for over 1,000 years. The technology was there. The engineering was there. But the infrastructure, the supply chains, the labor force, the civic will to maintain a public heating system was gone. And the people who had known how to manage it, the fornicatores who had kept the fires burning for 3 centuries, were gone with it. Their knowledge, never written down, was lost. That is what happens when a civilization treats its essential workers as expendable. the workers die, and the knowledge dies with them, and the marble goes cold. The first thing you notice is the lines. Short vertical scratches in the brick, 4 strokes side by side, then a 5th crossing through them diagonally. The universal tally mark, the oldest counting system in the world. You find them in the service tunnels of bathhouses across the Roman Empire, at Caracalla, at the Baths of Diocletian in Rome, at the legionary baths at Bath in Britain, at the military bathhouses along the Rhine frontier. Someone was counting. Counting what? This is the question that archaeologists return to again and again, and the answer is that we do not know for certain. Days, most likely. Shifts. The marks appear in groups, clusters of tallies separated by horizontal lines or gaps, as if each group represents a completed unit of something. 5 marks a gap. 5 marks a gap. A rhythm, a record. But the marks are not uniform. Some are scratched lightly, quick, almost casual, as if the hand that made them was in a hurry or barely paying attention. Others are cut deep into the brick, carved with deliberate force, as if the person making them needed the act of cutting to mean something. As if the physical effort of pressing a sharp edge into fired clay was itself the point, a way of saying, I was here, I existed. This day happened, and I marked it, and now it is recorded in the wall of this tunnel, and the wall will outlast me. There is something else in the tunnels. Not everywhere, not in every bathhouse, not in every tunnel, but in enough places to form a pattern. Small niches cut into the brick walls. Rough, unfinished, nothing like the elegant niches in the rooms above, which were faced with marble and designed to hold bronze statues. These are crude openings, hacked into the wall with a chisel barely 6 inches across. And in some of them, archaeologists have found the remains of small clay lamps, offering lamps, the kind used at household shrines, laryria, throughout the Roman world. Someone built a shrine in the tunnel. Not a grand one, not a marble altar with carved inscriptions and gilded reliefs. A niche in a brick wall, a clay lamp, perhaps a small figure, a terracotta Lares, a guardian spirit, the kind that a Roman household would keep in a wooden cabinet by the door in honor with offerings of wine and bread. The furnace workers had brought their gods underground, and beneath the Baths of Caracalla, they found something else, something larger than a niche, something that had been hidden for nearly 2,000 years.